The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, does the Piet Church of Christ require that women wear a head covering in worship?
No, sir.
Well, let's talk about that this evening then. Good evening. I'm Keith Sharp. You're watching Search the Scriptures. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. I'm going to let Trevor introduce himself and the congregation in Piet.
Sure, thanks, Keith. Yeah, my name is Trevor Campbell, and I worship and I preach over in Piet at the Church of Christ there on Highway 62 in Piet. North side of the highway is where you'll find our building where we meet and worship, and you'll see there on the screen there's our phone number. Well, that's my phone number. You can call me there, 870-435-2737. That's the number you can call me at if you have a question for the program, or if you have a question about the church that meets there or what we practice, give me a call there. And then our meeting times are a little different than what's on the screen right now. Currently, we're just meeting for worship service 10:45 a.m. on Sunday mornings. So if you're out in the Marion County area, live in that area, please come out and worship with us, study the Bible with us.
You folks in Marion County, be sure and visit the Piet Church of Christ. You will be benefited by having been there. You'll be edified. For those who live in Baxter County, we invite you to the services of the Highway 5 South Church of Christ. That's 1 mile south of the Highway 62 412 bypass. You go just past Good Samaritan on your right as you're going south, and then on your left will be the Highway 5 South Church of Christ building, and that's where we meet. As also like the congregation of Piet, our times are not the same now as are pictured, but rather we only have one service on Sunday. That's 11 o'clock. On Sunday morning, and of course everybody's invited to that, and we're still observing the safety precautions to keep from spreading the coronavirus. Hope that will be over with before too terribly long, but we're still observing the safety precautions. And then of course we invite you to our Wednesday evening service at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening, and we have a ladies' Bible class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. They're studying prayer. And that's a very good class from what I've heard from the ladies, and we invite you ladies to be a part of that class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Now, if you have a question for me for this program, and of course your questions generate the subject matter on this program, and that's been true from the very inception of the program, and we're very happy that we keep questions coming in, and the questions we can't quite keep up with them. That's a good problem to have. But you keep on sending us your questions, and we'll tell you what the Bible says. We won't tell you our opinions. We won't tell you what a church creed says. We'll tell you what the Bible says concerning your questions. And if you'd like to send in a question, then you can call me, Keith Sharp, at 870-321-5746, or you can email me at keithsharp2021@gmail.com. Or you can write to the Highway 5 South Church of Christ at Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Let us know what your questions are. Trevor, we have a question before us, and that question is the head covering of 1 Corinthians 11 verses 2 through 16 the hair or an artificial covering? Is it universally bound or a local custom? So there's two questions that deal with 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 through 16. And Trevor, I'm going to let you take it from there.
All right. Well, I'll get it started anyway. This is a question that comes up pretty often, not just on this program, but just in general. A lot of folks have questions about this topic, and because of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Well, I think one of the things that's overlooked many times is what Paul says towards the beginning of the chapter. And that really sets the tone for the chapter and really explains why he's talking about these things to begin with. I think we have a habit of sometimes jumping in the middle, going right to the passages that talk, the verses that is, that talk about the head covering, and sometimes there's a misunderstanding of why Paul brings these things up. But if you'll notice in verse 3 of the chapter, 11:3, Paul says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God." And then he begins talking about the head coverings. So it's very important to not overlook verse 3, in which he talks about the headship of man. That is that the woman is to be in subjection to the man. Now, this isn't true in every case, but it is true in two situations or two places. That is in the church and in the home. And that's the two places the Bible speaks of in which man has the headship. And so that's what Paul is talking about here. The head of woman is man. And to show these points, I'm going to go to a few passages, and then I'll turn it back over to Keith in a moment here. But I'm going to go to Ephesians chapter 5, first of all, where here in Ephesians 5, Paul talks about the headship of man in the home. If I can find Ephesians chapter 5 here. There it is. Ephesians chapter 5. And I'm going to begin reading at verse 22, where Paul says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." Well, in the text there, Paul is really dealing with Christ and the relationship with the church, his people. But he brings up a relationship that we can understand, and that's the husband and wife relationship. And in the home, and that's what I mentioned, in the home, the man has the headship. The husband is head of the wife, Paul says. But you'll also notice that this isn't any kind of, he's not to be a tyrant. He's not that kind of ruler in the household. He's not a dictator. But rather, he is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, verse 25. And what kind of love is that? Well, verse 25 says that he gave himself for her. So talking about the church there, Christ gave himself for us, that kind of sacrificial love. That kind of love a husband is to have for his wife. So yes, the husband is head of the household. He's the head of the wife, but he is also to love his wife as himself and love as Christ loved the church. Another good example of in the home is in Genesis chapter 3. That's really where it begins. In Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. In chapter 3 and in verse 16, now this is after they had sinned in the garden there and partaken of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God pronounces these curses upon them. And in verse 16, he says to the woman here that her husband is to rule over her. To the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And that's the first time we see that in the Bible. And again, it's at the very beginning. So throughout all of time, man has always had the headship in the home. The husband is the head of the wife. However, I do want to make it clear, I'm going to go to a passage in 1 Peter chapter 3, that again, even though man has the headship, he's not to be a tyrant or a dictator. He is to treat with his wife with love and respect. In 1 Peter chapter 3, and I think it's important to bring these things out because some people get upset when they hear that man is to have the headship in the home. Well, we have to understand what this means. He's the head of the house, and he is to be a leader in the home, and a religious leader for sure. But he is to show loving care towards his wife, and so that relationship works the way God wants it to work. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, Paul says, "Husbands, dwell with them," that's your wives, "with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered." Now in the text, this is a very interesting text. I don't want to get too off topic, but he mentions prayer at the end of the text. Husbands and wives need to act as God would have them to so that their prayers are heard. But notice what he says about the husbands. To dwell with your wife with understanding, giving honor to your wife, and furthermore, giving honor as to the weaker vessel. Now that's an odd translation, but in the original Greek language that Peter is writing and recording this in, what he's talking about is the more precious vessel. That's the idea of weaker there. It refers to fragile. It refers to, in this case, what he's literally referring to is like a precious vase. And us guys, we like to collect things. We might collect guns, we might collect records, what have you. And what do you do with your most prized one, your most prized possession? Well, it has a place of honor. And you keep it shined up and looking good, it might be behind glass or what have you. You honor it. Well, and that's kind of what he's dealing with here. He's using something we can associate with and understand, a physical item, but understanding you're to honor your wife, give her a place of honor in the home. So I wanted to bring those things out. But most importantly for our discussion, the headship of man is in the home, and then the other place is in the church. In 1 Corinthians, the same book that we're looking at right now with the head covering, but in chapter 14 and in verse 34, Paul says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says." Well, the law, I believe that he's in reference to there, is back there in Genesis 3:16, which we just looked at. "And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for women to speak in the church." All right, so here's an example of the headship of man. First we have it in the home, and now in the church. Another example is in 1 Timothy chapter 2. Hope I'm not taking any of your verses, Keith.
Go right ahead, Trevor. You're doing great.
All right. Well, I'll be stopping in just a minute here.
It's all right.
All right. 1 Timothy chapter 2, and in verse 11 says, "Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, and then Eve." Well, you might say, well, how do we know he's talking about the church here? Well, it goes and it coincides with what we read there in 1 Corinthians 14. But also, if you look at chapter 3 of this same text, in verse 15, Paul says that I write these things so that you know how to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. So we know that he's talking about conduct in the church. So again, here we have a woman learning in silence with all submission. These are the only two places, the home and the church, where man has the headship, and in which a woman must be in submission. When you look at the Bible, there are instances of women who had leadership roles in society. And in society, a woman can lead and have authority. Micah chapter 6 and verse 4 is a good example, in which God talks about the children of Israel coming up out of the land of Egypt. And God says, "I gave you Moses and Aaron and Miriam." And he said, "I sent them before you." Those were their leaders when they came up to the land of Egypt. Well, Miriam is a woman. That was the sister of Aaron and Moses. And Miriam was a prophetess. Another good example is the woman Deborah in the book of Judges. She was one of God's leaders. She was one of the judges there in Israel. So there are examples of women having leadership roles and having authority in society. But the headship of man applies to the church and in the home. And so, why am I bringing all these things up? Well, because Paul brings it up back here in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He brings it up to talk about this topic of the head covering. And so in verse 10 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he says, "For this reason the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head." Well, that symbol of authority that he's speaking of is that head covering, and it shows the authority of the husband. In other words, this is for a married woman. Her husband has the authority. She's showing that she's in submission. And this is not in church, and we know that because it says in the 5th verse, "Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head." We know that he's talking about outside the church, outside the assembly here, because women were not speaking and were not to speak in the churches. So a woman would be prophesying in church. This would be outside of the church. So the headship and the submission she needs to be showing is that in regard to her husband. And so we're dealing with things outside of the church. In fact, in the same chapter in verse 18, he says that when you come together as a church, and then he talks about the Lord's Supper. He switches gears there. But here in this portion of the text, in the first part of 1 Corinthians 11, he's dealing with a woman showing that she is in submission to her husband outside of the church. I've said a lot, Keith, so I'm gonna stop. I didn't mean to talk so long.
You did fine, Trevor, and I appreciate your good comments. They were good comments. And so what you've done is really set the context for the question.
Yes, hopefully.
The significance of the head covering is it's a symbol of authority. By the way, just a brief comment there on the passage that you noted in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10, that phrase, "a symbol of authority." The original word is just the word for authority. And the translators have added that a symbol of, but I think they're correct in adding that. That's what the head covering symbolized, was that they are in submission to the authority that is over them, that is, their own husbands. And they were in submission to that. Well, is that something? Well, let me back up. What is that head covering? That was the specific question that we were given. And let's just look back at 1 Corinthians 11. And I'm going to begin in verse 4, because that's where the head covering begins to be mentioned. And let's see if we can discern, beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 4, see if we can discern whether this is talking about long hair as the head covering, or whether it's an artificial head covering that would be over their hair. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. What is the question? If this is talking about hair, is it wrong for a man to have hair? Now, of course, you can look at my head, and I might say, well, yeah, it's wrong for a man to have hair, but you know I would not take that position. No, it's not wrong for a man to have hair. Well, is it wrong for a man to have long hair? Well, that's another question. But let's just read on to see what he's talking about. Every woman who prays or prophesied with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Well, how would her head be uncovered? Well, let's just read on, see if we can discern this. For that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. Now notice, here's a comparison between the hair being cut off and the woman being uncovered. So it would appear to me, I believe it's implied, that the head covering he's talking about here is an artificial head covering. That is something that went over their hair, something that was called a veil. And then he went ahead to say, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. Well, see, being shorn, that is having her hair cut, would be in addition to being uncovered. So again, it appears to me, I believe it's implied, that he's, in this context, he's talking about an artificial head covering, a veil, that the woman would wear in Corinth. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So it appears to me, in the first part of the chapter, verses 4 through 7, when he talks about the covering, he's talking about an artificial head covering, specifically a veil. But now skip down to verses 13 and 14. And here's not a matter of what's implied, it's a matter of what's specifically stated. Judge among yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. So in this context, verses 13 through 15, he specifies that the long hair is the covering. So I would conclude, just by looking at the passages in their context, that he's including both in this discussion, both long hair versus short hair, and an artificial head covering, a veil, versus no artificial head covering. That both the long hair and the veil were to the women in Corinth a symbol of the authority that they recognized in their husbands, a symbol of their submission to their husbands. And so it included both of those. Now, the problem would be then, is this something that is bound on us today? Is it bound on us? Now, notice carefully before you say yes or no. There's two things discussed here. There's short hair and long hair. There is an artificial head covering and no artificial head covering. Those were something that were important in Corinth, are the important universally. Well, there's a key passage, I believe, and that's verse 16. In verse 16, but if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. What custom has he been discussing throughout this passage, beginning all the way back in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. That's where the context begins, and the context ends in verse 16. What is the custom that he's talking about? Well, before we answer that, I want to look at the word custom itself. There's two different Greek words that are used in the New Testament for custom. That is, for something that people do as a matter of an ongoing practice that becomes a part of a society. We would call it customary, something that they simply do because that's something that people do because they've always done it that way. Well, there's two words for the word custom. One is the Greek word ethos, and you can see we get our word ethics from that. And that is a word that would include custom as a matter of divine law. But then there's a different word for custom, and that different word for custom is the word that is used here. It is not the word for that which is prescribed by divine law. Over in John chapter, by the way, it's the word sunetheia. Over in John chapter 18, we read that the Jews had a custom that Pilate, the Roman governor, would release to them a prisoner at the time of the Passover. Well, that wasn't bound by divine law. That was simply a practice that had been going on for some time that apparently the Roman governors had allowed in order to try to placate the Jews. And so this was something that they customarily did, but it was not a matter of divine law. That's John 18, verse 38. Well, or verse 39, excuse me. Well, this is the very word that is used in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. The word for something that is done as a customary practice, but is not bound by divine law. Now, to underscore that, this matter of something being a practice, but is not universally bound. Notice what Paul says about that custom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16, he says, "We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God." So whatever the custom was, they had at Corinth, which was women wearing long hair, men wearing short hair, and the women having an artificial head covering, but the man not having one, and the women wearing that long hair and artificial head covering as a symbol of the authority of their husbands over them. Whatever this custom was, it was not a universal custom. He said, we don't have that custom. Quite often, the Apostle Paul, who was ethnically, racially a Jew, used the word we of the Jews and the word you of the Gentiles. He does this, for example, in Galatians chapter 3. The law was the schoolmasters bring us to Christ. Well, who was brought to Christ by the law? Not the Gentiles, but the Jews. The Gentiles never had the law. That was God's law to bring the Jews to Christ. I believe that's what we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. The Jews had no such custom as the women wearing a head covering and the men going uncovered. And by the way, that included in worship. The priests had to wear a turban. In the Old King James, it's called a mitre, but that's a head covering. The priests had to wear that when they worshiped God. It was unlawful for them to not wear a head covering when they worshiped God. The Jews didn't have that practice of the men having their heads uncovered and the women having their heads covered. That was a Jewish custom. A Gentile custom in contrast with the Jews. And so what Paul is telling us is that the practice he's talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the practice of a woman having head covering as a symbol of authority is a practice that the Gentiles had, but the Jews did not have. And by the way, something else about the length of hair. That also was not a Jewish custom. The Jews, a woman could be under the Nazirite vow, just as a man could be under the Nazirite vow. And under the Nazirite vow, their hair was to grow uncut as long as they were under the vow. But when the vow was over with, they were to shave their heads and shave all the hair off their body. And to burn that hair before God, And so both men and women could either have long hair or even have their head shaved. Not only was that not something that was shameful, they were considered to be particularly holy to God. They'd given themselves entirely to service to God. That's what the Nazarite was. Samson was to be a Nazarite from his mother's womb, from the time he was born. He was never to have his hair cut. It was not a shame to him. It was not a sin for him to have long hair. In fact, the sin was involved when his hair was cut. That's when he lost his strength, because it was a violation of the Nazarite vow that he was under his entire life. And so two things were a matter of custom: the long hair for the women, the short hair for the men, and the artificial head covering for the woman. Both of those symbolizing that she was in subjection to her husband, that she recognized his authority, and the men wearing no artificial head covering. And that would be particularly true in worship, where the Jews, under the Jewish worship, did wear an artificial head covering in worship. Well, Trevor, forgive me. I'm going to make one other observation, then I'll see if you have something you want to add to this. What does that mean? Well, first of all, I believe it does mean that the artificial head covering is not bound on women today, except in societies where that is still a custom for the women to have their heads covered to symbolize their subjection to their husband. I'll give you an example of that. I preached in Nigeria the first time in 1992. I preached in a place where the Yoruba tribe was the dominant tribe. And there the women wore an artificial head covering as a symbol of authority to their husbands. And I told the women, you keep wearing that head covering, because in your society, that's a symbol of your subjection to your husband. So wear that artificial head covering. That would be in fulfillment of what Paul said to the Gentile women in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16. In our society, it has no such symbolic value. In our society, for a woman to wear a veil or a long artificial head covering, that would probably just symbolize what she was religiously. It wouldn't have anything to do with symbolism towards being in subjection to her husband. Well, now here's another question. What about the length of hair? I believe it's still a matter of custom in Western society. Now, I know there's lots of rebellion against this custom, but usually that rebellion is exactly that. It's rebellion against how society is. That the usual custom in Western society still is that men have their hair shorter than the women. And so I would still say men in Western society should keep their hair short enough that you can be recognized as a man, because that is a custom that differentiates between the men and the women, and Paul is teaching that in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Well, Trevor, I've used up most of the time. Forgive me, please. Why don't you wind this down for us?
You're just getting me back. What I did in the beginning of the program. I thought that was very good. I agreed with everything you said there, Keith. I will say this, if anyone has further questions about this, or that we didn't answer this to satisfy you, please let us know. Give us a call. And of course, as always, continue to give us your questions. Call us or email us. Give us your questions, right, Keith? What have you. Anything you have about the Bible that we can answer for you, or try to answer using the Word of God, we'd love to do so. Please keep in contact with us. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email Keith Sharp at suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.